Szanowni Państwo, dziś polecam książkę absolutnie wyjątkową Biała Armia Antona Denikina. Po raz pierwszy zresztą wydana w Polsce przez wydawnictwo Deregio. To nie tylko fascynująca opowieść o heroicznych zmaganiach rosyjskich ochotników przeciwko bolszewikom, ale też bezcenne źródło historyczne stworzone przez jednego z najważniejszych świadków tamtej epoki. To książka, która wciąga, porusza i pozwala zrozumieć dramatyczny wymiar walki z rodzącym się komunizmem. Link do tej i innych książek znajdziecie w opisie dzisiejszego programu. Polecam bardzo serdecznie. Dr Michał Krupa.
Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of DR Global, the English language podcast of Do Rzeczy, Poland's largest conservative weekly. Here we speak with English-speaking thinkers, analysts, and commentators about global events from a realist and common sense perspective. Conversations we believe are essential for Polish audience seeking clarity in a rapidly changing and multipolar world. Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Deregio Publishing House. You'll find the link in the description box, including all of Deregio's books, and we will be showing some of those books in our upcoming episodes with our fantastic guests. If you'd like to support our work directly, there's a link for Buy Me a Coffee also in the description box, and hopefully you will find the time and the patience to support our work, because although we are inaugurating today, we do have fairly ambitious plans going forward. So hope everyone will join us, and hope to see you on Buy Me Coffee and as you watch our program. So let's get started. Today we have a very special guest who I was very anxious to invite for our first episode, because his work is so important with regard to what's happening in Poland and on the international arena as we speak. So our guest today is the one and only Professor Richard Sakwa, who is a British political scientist, Professor Emeritus of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent. He is known for his scholarship on Russia, Eastern Europe, and post-communist political systems. Professor Sakwa has authored at least 30 books on these subjects, and I have to say, one of his books was actually a fairly good companion of mine during my last vacation on a Tunisian beach. So all the more welcome, Professor Sakwa, to DR Global.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and I certainly wish you success in your new program.
Thank you very much. Well, if we have guests like you, I'm pretty sure we'll be launching very fast and with utmost success. Professor, let's get started. I recently read your recent book, The Culture of the Second Cold War. You will also find the link to that book in our description box, which is a book I highly recommend to all our watchers. The book basically talks about a lot of the things that we see in the media regarding the narrative surrounding Russia, NATO expansion, Ukraine, but sometimes we don't understand why these narratives are so systematic. And Professor Sakwa does an excellent job in his book of basically dissecting where these narratives come from and how they accompany the very aggressive rhetoric that we see in our media, in our political landscape regarding everything pertaining to Russia, and especially the Russia-Ukrainian war. Professor, I want to start off with this question, because we are in the middle of another apparent, Russian sabotage attack on Poland. As many of you have probably heard, there was an apparent sabotage of a railway line in Poland leading to Ukraine by apparent Russian agents. Now, I'm saying apparent because we don't have any conclusive proof of this, but everybody in Poland, in the mainstream media and in the political class, unfortunately, and I'm also sorry to say the military class, has jumped to the conclusion that basically a war has been declared on Poland. So these expectations without concrete proof seem to fit the profile of the culture of the Second Cold War, Professor, which you write about in your excellent book. And I would like you to start off with trying to place what we're seeing right now in Poland in the broader context of these anti-Russian expectations you so thoroughly explained in the book, The Culture of the Second Cold War.
Yeah, the book is basically trying to get at what I call the meta politics of our time. That is the deeper currents. Clearly, we're all like corks caught in a stormy sea, reacting to day-to-day events. And of course, there's a flood of day-to-day events which are more and more disturbing. Not just the event you've just talked about, but just a couple of weeks ago, the attack on two oil refineries, one in Romania, one in Hungary, quite astonishing events. The suppression of the investigation into who destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines in September 2022. And the list could go on. And indeed, the way I nowadays look at it, I mean, there's many factors, but Europe has been seized by a war fever. It's a sort of war fever which is similar to that before 1914. And there are dozens of books which try to explain that war fever before 1914. One school of thought, which applies to our times as well, one school of thought says that the war of 1914 was effectively a reflection of domestic contradictions that United Kingdom, for example, or before it was even Great Britain at the time, was facing effectively a civil war in Ireland, in Northern Ireland in particular, but Ireland in general, and so much more. France as well. Germany was torn internally. Uh, I'm not convinced. Yes, and sure, there was a sense that the adulation of war and that war would, as it were, purge the societies of all sorts of contradictions. I mean, that's certainly part of the story, and it applies to today. The bankruptcy of our contemporary political elites, the exhaustion of any major projects for progress, for development, indeed for peace, for engagement, has reached such a high level. The bankruptcy, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have a Labour government which really simply does not know how to govern. It has no ideas of what it should be doing, and hence it's staggering from one crisis to the next. And I think the same applies to France and Germany, slightly less to Italy, but to most other countries as well. So that's the background. I mean, I won't go into the more detailed philosophical aspects of the metapolitics, but there's a deeper currents which we and I've been trying to identify.
Well, that's an excellent segue into my next question, because the expectations that are directed against Russia seem to stem, and you, I think, pinpoint this in the book, from this non-tolerance of duality of systems, whereas liberalism or liberal democratism is the only sort of political form that is allowed to exist. That anything that is outside of the West is, as former European Union's foreign policy chief Borrell said, it's basically the jungle. And I'm getting the sense in Poland that we are losing more and more as time goes by any semblance of rational perspective on Russia, because Russia is not seen as a state with its problems, obviously, with its general interests, some bigger, some smaller, but we see Russia in metaphysical terms. And there are Polish authors like Professor Bronisław Łagowski, Professor Andrzej Walicki, excellent Russian scholars who see the situation very similarly as you, as not seeing Russia as a nation state with its own particular culture and political form, but as the metaphysical other. And can you expand on how we see manifestations of this otherness in the current culture of the Second Cold War?
Yeah, my timescale for the immediate issue. There's obviously a longer timescale. Is the development of what I call the political West. This is a very strange political, ideological, military formation which emerged after 1945. And of course, in 1945, there were attempts to establish through the United Nations what I call the Charter International System, based on sovereign internationalism. This was a vision of pluralism, of a world made up of different countries at different stages of development. Post decolonizing, of course, that was part of the element, but we would have we then within this charter international system based on sovereign internationalism, we had in the early years, in the Cold War years, on the one side, the Soviet bloc, and on the other side, we had what I call the political West. This political West, it was a vision of world order, and its ideology was not sovereign internationalism, but liberal globalism, the vision that its model of modernity was effectively a universal model. As long as the Soviet Union existed, it did two things. First, it forced the political West to adapt its own model of capitalism to a more welfare state, social democratic. It actually improved the Western life itself to face the challenge and the ideological challenge of revolutionary socialism represented by the Soviet bloc. It also did another thing, and that was if you like, the militarization and ideologization of political of cultural life in the political West. After 1989, the alternative model of world order represented by the Soviet bloc collapsed. This unleashed enormous forces within the political West. We assumed that with the Cold War over, we didn't need NATO, we didn't need the intense othering of those outside of the political West. Unfortunately, we saw the radicalization of the political West after 1989, and even more after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That this political West then emerges as an alternative to the sovereign internationalism of the charter system, of the United Nations based system, and the whole body of international law on which on which basis it was developed. So the political West radicalizes in all sorts of ways. I won't go into detail now, but later on it calls itself the liberal international order, the rules-based order, basically usurping what should have been the universal rights and duties within the charter system. So we have a political West which radicalizes. In those early days of unipolarity in the 1990s, China was still in the very early stages of development. And so there was no sustained alternative vision of world order. And it allowed, crazy Fukuyama type esque Hegelian visions of the end of history, Kantian visions of universal human rights with all of its contradictions, which this radicalization could not understand and could not tolerate something outside of itself. So the story of NATO enlargement is only a relatively small part of what was the enlargement of a whole model of world order. And that's why Russia was could not be. Russia wanted to join this political West. We know that Gorbachev talked about it, above all Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, and Putin in his early years. We know, and famously now, that he asked Clinton in the year 2000, can we join NATO? Because he understood the security dilemma that if Russia remained outside. And then the question becomes, why couldn't Russia join the political West? There's all sorts of internal reasons. It would have undermined the model of US hegemony. It would have decentered Washington, which of course is the leader of the political West. It would have also meant an ideological challenge, because it would have said, well, that the Western model of liberal globalism is not universal, because Russia was already even from Gorbachev, but even more under Yeltsin, developing a vision of its own sovereignty, and under under Putin, even more. And it would have meant a displacement, both ideological and geopolitical, of US hegemony. European powers, of course, the East European powers, very much endorsed this. And there we have to see in play that the European Union was unable to emerge as an agent, a political agent, what later is called with strategic autonomy. It was basically a subaltern element of the political West. And of course, this was exploited by elites in Poland and Baltic republics and elsewhere. And for me, this is one of the great tragedies of our time, that instead of the European Union developing as a peace project, doing to Russia what it did to Germany and France at the end of the Second World War, make war impossible between these two major states. In fact, it did the opposite. It generated conflict instead of being consistently moving towards peace and reconciliation. It allowed the Eastern European revanchist forces, and we know how strong they are in Poland, obviously they're not unchallenged, to set an agenda and move the European Union from being this, what we always thought was a peace project, into a project which amplifies grievances. Now, we all know that the grievances were genuine, that historical injustices were mighty, especially against Poland, the deportations before 1941 and so on. We all know that. But it was Russia was in part emerging as an independent state precisely in revolt against the Soviet Union, which had conducted all of that. We could get into a different issue, which is, but another one is to say that the political West from 1945, there is another West, and this is the imperial West since 1492, the age of colonialism, of slavery, of exploitation. Again, Russia was also orthogonal to this imperial West. Its own model of development was different. I mean, we could call it imperial, call it clearly it was in certain respects, but it certainly was a unique civilizational framework. And of course, those resentments are coming back as well. For example, in the Polish project, the Three Seas project, and the Intermarium, I mean, in some ways is reminiscent of Pilsudski's ideas of the 1930s. So there are multiple layers to all of this, and I think that to unpack them, we need to unpack them to begin to understand why this intense othering of Russia today.
Professor, you touched upon Atlanticism also in the culture of the Second Cold War, and also in your other excellent book, which we'll also put in the description box for audience, the beach book for me, The Lost Peace. You talk about Atlanticism, which is important because there was an interview just a few days back with the Financial Times with the equivalent of the national security advisor in Poland to the Polish president, so Professor Sławomir Cęckiewicz, who's a well-known historian from the Institute of National Remembrance. And he stated in that interview, right towards the end, that I quote, "We are Atlanticists, we are pro-American, and we know that NATO is the only viable military institution that Poland can belong to." On the other hand, you also see this rhetoric which dates back to the Cold War. We see the slogans being thrown around with such terms as the free world versus Russia. Now, of course, you know, the anti-Russian hysteria of Western European countries, setting that apart. But I've noticed that this Cold War rhetoric, even there, seems to have moved away a bit, and they are sort of updating their terminology, which is still directed at the wrong aims, but nobody in the West is using terms, the free world. Maybe, uber boomers like Joe Biden might have used them, but even Donald Trump hasn't used the term free world, right? At least I haven't noticed. And I'm wondering, in your assessment, where does this incessant Cold War nostalgia come from in so many of the Polish elites above 50 years of age?
Yeah, no, there's at least two things going on there. To begin with, the Atlanticist vision. The political West, this US-led military ideological political alliance established after 1945, was precisely this Atlantic alliance, and of course its foundations lay in the Atlantic Charter of 1941. It's so Atlanticism after 1989, after the Cold War, was, we assumed, defunct. It was no longer required. The Soviet Union was dead. Russia was moving at the time towards democracy, certainly towards reconciliation with the political West, and indeed with Poland, as we saw Putin's visit when I think it was 2010 to Warsaw. So there were all sorts of attempts to to move towards what us old Gaullists would argue to a pan-continental vision, that to restore continentalism versus Atlanticism. And for me, this is one of the big arguments, which, a big battle, and it was quite an explicit one, that the idea of these neo-Gaullist ideas, which in the Russian language became Gorbachevian in terms of a common European home. Under Putin, it was described as Большая Европа, Greater Europe, and even Mitterrand, Confederation of Europe. There's always been this lower level threnody underneath the Cold War, which actually challenged Cold War postulates, and that's perhaps one reason why Atlanticism ultimately defeated continentalism, pan-continentalism. Second, you're absolutely right. This revival of Cold War language is fundamental. It's, even though it's couched, as you say, slightly differently. Already under Reagan, by the way, the language of freedom had slightly given way to a different type of formulation of the Cold War contestation. I mean, he used it occasionally, but it wasn't so central, and it had moved to, if you like, a civilizational plane, that this was an evil empire, that it was no longer just another protagonist, and in fact, a rebellious child of Western modernity, because what is Marxism after all, if not an attempt to fulfill the promise of Western modernity through removing the class and economic exploitation at its heart? So, and so it shifted to a much more primitive level, if you like, because if you're having a civilizational conflict, there can be no room for dialogue, for discourse, and that's why, as I argue in the book, The Culture of the Second Cold War, that diplomacy, which did work in the first Cold War. There was a hotline after the Cuban Missile Crisis between Washington and Moscow, and there were strategic arm talks. And of course, we had détente of the early 1970s. And France and Germany had constant contact with the Soviet leaders. All that has gone. And of course, you mentioned the Polish position. It's quite extraordinary the way that the Eastern Europeans are less Europeans, but as you just said, they're more Atlanticist. It's an attempt to escape from their geopolitical position. It's a type of political voluntarism, which, of course, then generates contradictions, generates tension, and of course, you have to have it directed against the other, which, of course, in this case, is Russia. Even before the war today, I heard some extraordinary statements from Polish leaders. I remember one, I think he was a former defense minister in Poland, and I think we were talking in 2016 at a conference, where he made the astonishing statement, and I realized the total bankruptcy of a certain part of the Polish elite, when he said that Putin is worse than Hitler. The enormity of a statement like that, the enormity, so shocked me, and it still shocks me to this day, that anybody in any responsible position could say something like that. It does show the way that a particularly an Atlanticized elite, deeply plugged into Washington, deeply plugged in to funding by USAID and George Soros and many other, the Atlantic Council, and it was quite conscious that they've nurtured an elite. The Polish foreign minister of today is clearly one of those liberal globalists who simply cannot and will not understand that Russia has its own national interest. Of course, it's a like China, like India, it's a major sovereign power, and it's going to be very difficult. You have to work hard to maintain decent relations, but the investment in time and effort, as with China or India, is obviously important and necessary, even to this day, as we reach the end game of the Ukraine war, that we have to start thinking what comes afterwards.
I would say the funny, at the same time tragic thing about Sikorsky is that, there were recordings of his private conversations back in 2015 when he was discussing political issues, even the big political issues, with members of his party. And he actually made a statement that, Poland becoming an enemy of Germany and Russia at the same time is the stupidest of policies. And unfortunately, we're seeing sort of semblance of that right now. because he was basically implying that it's actually good to have friends nearby and enemies far away and not the other way around. But I guess
Yeah.
maybe it's the influence of his globalist wife on his political perception. Professor, you've written much also about Putin himself, about the internal dynamics of Russian politics. I also highly recommend everyone to read Professor Sakwa's book, great book, The Putin Paradox, which came out just a few years before the war, but everything in there, I at least
2020.
believe, is still 2020, right? So 2 years before the initiation of the, I guess, more kinetic version of the war between Russia and Ukraine. But Professor, I want to play a little bit neocon devil's advocate at this point, because the line of argumentation in many so-called analysts in Poland is, okay, maybe Putin is not determined to expand, the Soviet empire and to rebuild it again. That's obviously a fool's errand. But he is determined to consolidate and rebuild through military means what many in Russia and what many in the West took as a sort of propaganda slogan, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, that Putin's expansionism isn't so much neo-Soviet or communist, but it's more nationalist and cultural in a way. Now, the argument from a realist perspective, from people like you, Mearsheimer, others, is that Russia is reacting to perceived threats to her general national interests and national security. But I do notice that this argument resonates with a lot of people in Eastern Europe, that it's not so much about rebuilding the Soviet Union, but about rebuilding the Ruski Mir, about which Putin, longs for the return of. What's your take on such
Mm.
assertions?
I think that Russia is a very complicated socium, political formation. Uh, I mean, I do stick to the view that this war and the larger conflict with the West is about the security dilemma, and above all, NATO enlargement is a symbolic of that, and it's part of a much larger security and identity conflict. But within Russia, you're absolutely right. There are elements, and we could point to them, which would say that they do want to re-establish some sort of cultural uh, a cultural formation larger than a contemporary Russian state. But the thing about Putin is, and as described or analyzed in the Putin Paradox book, basically I'm arguing that at, at, at the absolute abstract conceptual level, Russia has at least four major factions in conflict. You still have the economic liberals who are running macroeconomic policy. For example, Elvira Nabiullina at the head of the Central Bank of Russia. There are few of them, even Siluanov, the Minister of Finances. They're absolutely orthodox economists under huge pressure internally, by the way, to adopt more interventionist, more neo-Soviet methods of economic management. And of course, the wars forced them to move towards military Keynesianism. The second big faction, the actual political liberals are marginalized, of course, today, mostly in exile. The second faction are the so-called Siloviki, the security apparatus, who do have a vision of Russia under permanent attack, that security is the number one issue. And these are the people who dominate the Security Council, the FSB, that's the successor to the KGB, and so on. They consider themselves Ochranitili. They're defenders of Russia. And this goes back to all the way the paranoia from going back to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. The third faction are neo-traditionalists. Now, these people do want to see, these include monarchists, neo-Soviets, neo-Stalinists, all sorts of people, and traditionalists and nationalists. And they do want forms of economic and political and obviously identity statecraft. And this is where the Ruski Mir fits in. And then, of course, you have the Eurasianists who say, no, it was always a false idea that we could engage with the West. And this goes back the 500 years I mentioned, that we were always never part. We entered the European state system, but we were never genuinely accepted in it. And we could go back to the Crimean War, the Great Northern War, and so on to prove it. against Sweden. So the answer to say that when you point to what these elements, yes, you will, if you wanted to, and we're talking about Konstantin Malafeев and Alexander Dugin and so on, and genuine neo-traditionalists and Eurasianists, you could always find people in Russia who do have that view. But Putin and his model of statecraft is to take from them all, to give all these factions, these meta factions, mega factions even, to give them all a stake in the system, but none can dominate. None can dominate. And so his own policies are pragmatic. For example, when it came to after the Maidan revolution of February 2014, soon afterwards, we know the insurgency in Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. And yet with Putin, when they had the referendum or voting on 11th of May 2014, he opposed it. And of course, many within Russia were saying, look, we really need to intervene much more firmly. He didn't. Yes, they intervened in Ilovaisk in August 2014 and Debaltseve February 2015. But, if he was intent on expanding the empire, then of course he could have annexed these parts, Donetsk and Lugansk, far earlier. He refused to do so. Obviously, you could say Minsk was a way of influencing domestic Ukrainian policies to ensure that it becomes neutral and less of a military threat. Yes, that was part of the debate. So, but ultimately, uh, uh, I know, talking about Russia's national security culture, it is defensive. There's certainly this idea of this war fever in Russia, that there will be war with Russia and Russia will be ready to invade the rest of Poland and the Baltic republics in 3 or 4 years. It's clearly a completely nuts, crazy idea. Um, well, it depends, of course, how this Ukraine war, because we're entering now a decisive phase in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And in my view, this is perhaps more dangerous than it has been for the last 4 years. It's more dangerous not just because of the nuclear risks, but there's a danger of Ukraine in one way or another imploding. And the first to suffer will be Poland if Ukraine sinks into civil war or dominance by an extreme ultra-nationalist right-wing faction who have no love for Poland, as one can remember from the 1930s.
A disaster of our own making, in a way, unfortunately. I mean, we do remember the participation of Radek Sikorski, then also foreign minister, in 2014 when the Maidan compromise collapsed literally after a couple of hours. I mean, Poland and Germany were supposed to be guarantors of that peace. Well, that turned out completely differently. Radek Sikorski, like the good Pontius Pilate he is, unfortunately washed his hands of any responsibility in that regard. I guess signatures and words don't mean much to Western politicians, unfortunately. But Professor, you touched upon an important issue in terms of the war, because we're a couple of months now out after the Anchorage summit, which, a lot of people are asking, well, what was achieved between President Trump and President Putin? We've seen Trump going back and forth. We know the sanctions are on the table for Lukoil and the Russian oil industry. Trump seems to have some sort of hesitation. We've noticed even remarkable statements from Secretary of State Marco Rubio a few days ago, where he says, I mean, we've really sanctioned everything in Russia. There's really nothing left to sanction. And I think that does point to a decisive moment in this war, whereby Russia will basically, at least that's my view at this point, because all the information on the ground seems to point to it, unless Donald Trump comes out with some sort of magic proposal and they do meet in Budapest. But I think today, as we sit here, I think Putin has decided on, 80% or just over 80%, it's going to be a military victory that's going to decide the future of this conflict, and not diplomacy, especially if you consider the whole Epstein affair in which Donald Trump is enmeshed in his own country, and what's happening within the MAGA movement. Things seem to be going in the direction of a kinetic, unfortunate because of loss of life, resolution to the Ukraine war. What's your assessment?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that we always say that there can be no military solution and that we have to find a way forward through diplomacy. Well, unfortunately, the stubbornness of the Kiev leadership and if you like, the militancy of the European Union and the European countries establishing this coalition of the willing. For example, our dear leader, Keir Starmer, who absolutely refused to call for a ceasefire during the mass murder in Gaza, yet he insisted on an immediate and unmediated ceasefire when it comes to Ukraine, which, of course, blocked and after Anchorage, if you remember, the seven dwarfs, as some people call them, European leaders, and you remember that famous picture of them sitting at the White House,
Yeah.
sitting like school children with school teacher Daddy Donald Trump lecturing them. One of the most humiliating moments in European history, actually, in my view. But keen and believing that Ukraine can win this war. As you say, the military balance is shifting towards Russia's advantage. Ukraine is running out of people; it's running out of morale. The over 360,000 have deserted since the beginning of the war, tens of thousands just in the last month, 30,000 in October alone. So the fronts are collapsing. It's quite clear that not just around Pokrovsk, but also further north towards Kharkov, and indeed on the Zaporozhye front, all around. So it's very clear that this war is coming to its end game. What comes afterwards? There's still a view in the West that, there's several if you like, models. One of them is the Israel model that Ukraine becomes an armed porcupine. But of course, why on earth should Russia, after so much sacrifice, allow that to happen? It's quite likely that Russian forces will be along the Dnieper by the middle of next year. It won't happen immediately, but it's a slow motion collapse. Though, of course, things could move very suddenly. The another danger, another model, not the one that the West wants, which is some sort of armed, militarized rump Ukraine. Another version, of course, would be the post First World War Germany after 1918 into 1919, ravaged by Freikorps, by a very militant, as we know, the right wing, the ultra right, the Azov Battalion, which is major unit in the army, regular army, and in the National Guard, that they start setting the political agenda as they have done since the Maidan Revolution of 2014. Obviously, they wield a vastly disproportionate influence compared to the amount of votes they get in elections or did get. So there's all sorts of models of looking forwards. There's let me just think that there's ideally, Russia has always wanted the Finlandization option for what's left of Ukraine. So, there's a number of example. One version, another type of post-war German model is that it becomes like Syria during the Civil War.
Mhm.
Just so it's quite clear that the Zelensky regime has run out of time. It's quite possible that this whole scandal at the moment over Mindich and others was effectively given the green light from
Yeah.
Washington that Trump is tired of Zelensky. So there's so many options and possibilities, but all that one can say the bottom line is that none of them are good unless we can start a diplomatic process. And that's why there's even Lavrov just the other day said that the Alaska process is not over, that
Mhm.
obviously the meeting in Istanbul earlier on didn't get anywhere, and in and in Saudi Arabia. So we're looking for perhaps indeed, and just recently Budapest is back on the agenda as a possibility. And of course,
Yeah.
I would very much welcome that. But yet again, all that does is reinforce the way that Europe, and it's on our continent that this war is taking place, and yet European powers are marginalized. including Poland, are really marginalized. And the decisions ultimately will be taken on how this war ends in Moscow and in Washington. And hopefully with the participation of Viktor Orban in Budapest, and that really would be helpful. But basically, the big decisions are not taken by we, who are the major players. And that's again a sign of this morbid Atlanticism, which has overshadowed and destroyed the vision which we had at the end of the Cold War of the reunification of the continent from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Can you believe it that at an earlier point I was saying that the capital of this new European or Asian confederation should be in Warsaw, because it's at exactly the midpoint between London and Moscow. And of course, those visions have long gone.
O realism, where art thou in Warsaw? One wants
Indeed.
to ask. But Professor, you talked about being marginalized. The tragedy, I think, of the current European elites, most of them, with some exceptions of Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, is they were self-marginalized. I mean, nobody forced them to be marginalized as potential players in the settlement. And my final question in this regard is of this marginalization, because we've seen this also on the part of Poland. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, our president, our newly elected president, with whom a lot of people are hoping will move away from some of the more extreme and irrational positions of the former president, President Duda. We're all hoping and praying for that. But he made a startling statement, President Nawrocki, a couple of weeks ago, where in an interview he said, the only person who can negotiate with Vladimir Putin is Donald Trump.
Mm.
There's nobody else who can negotiate with President Putin. Now, he said, obviously, he was pushed by the interviewer, but what if, circumstances were such that you had to? He said, well, if circumstances were such that I had to, I would obviously talk to Putin, which is still a move closer to some semblance of rationality if you consider the former occupant of the presidential administration in Poland. But still, I mean, as Polish voters, we didn't vote for Donald Trump to negotiate on our behalf. We voted for Karol Nawrocki. Now, obviously, there are constitutional constraints on the power of the president in Poland. However, the attitude that I can't talk to Putin, despite the fact that I can, I'm going to, cede all that responsibility to a foreign leader, in this case, Donald Trump, seems a bit out there to me. And I was wondering, if you were called to counsel the presidential administration, if they called you up and said, Professor Sakwa, Putin's mindset, you've studied him. What do you recommend we do? Can we, as Poles, open even, back channel negotiations with him? Or is there nothing to negotiate about between Poland and Russia? What would the counsel of Professor Kissinger Sakwa be in this regard?
My slogan has always been, following on from Winston Churchill, jaw, jaw is better than war, war. In other words, talk, talk. Absolutely. There is so much to talk about. We saw that Viktor Orban, when he was head of the European Council, the 6 month head of the council, that he immediately went off to Washington and Moscow and other countries to try to broker some sort of peace, which I very much supported. My advice to Nawrocki, and indeed to Tusk and Sikorski, if that's possible, is that they would find, if they opened up, and this is what's astonishing, that we're in the fourth year of war, and no European Union leader has engaged in the slightest with Russia, which is very different, even in the second year of the First World War. Towards the end of 1916, the Germans actually put forward a peace plan. It was rejected by the West, but it so alarmed Washington, which is why in early 1917, Woodrow Wilson then stepped in, because there was, I won't go into all the details, but the point is that there were some moments at which there were ideas of negotiation. What makes this so awful, this war, is that the initiative and the idea of even talking to Moscow is And of course, as I described in the book, it's not just no engagement with Russian political and diplomatic elites, but no engagement and this discussion, this vision of a complete cultural and sporting and breaking every possible link. The European Union today is even now planning and contemplating the 20th round of sanctions. And as you noted, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, said that we've run out of things to sanction. There's nothing left. Yet the Europeans are still intent on doing this to damage themselves even more, of course, because Macron, in his earlier manifestation, always used to argue that ultimately there can be no peace, no security in Europe against Russia. It has to be with it. And my advice would be you would very quickly find people, interlocutors within the Russian establishment. I've been attending a number of conferences in Moscow. I won't give too much statement, but just even, for example, based at some of the institutes of the Academy of Sciences. And it's even now in the fourth year of war, there is still a huge, if you like, reservoir of people who are willing to engage. And I'm talking about senior officials within the Kremlin itself. Obviously, Lavrov is the foreign minister, but advisors to Putin, they would immediately respond to an initiative. And I would even go further that Poland, as one of the major countries in Eastern Europe and today emerging as a major military and economic power within Europe more broadly, that perhaps it does lie upon itself to take the initiative to work with Orban and Fico and Babiš in the Czech Republic and perhaps and some others to do a diplomatic initiative to because the Navratsky was absolutely right that at the moment the only serious interlocutor is Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, as we know, is a very has a very individual personality and indeed unstable and inconsistent positions. Uh, so, therefore, I think there's enormous scope for somebody like Navratsky. One would be very interested to see, of course, what the domestic reaction would be. But leadership means leading. It means taking the initiative. And that is one of the great failings of the European Union. Because what European Union has done, it has smothered, it has defanged those legacy powers, even the United Kingdom, which is not part of it, but France and Germany, that we have ceded sovereignty and authority and responsibility to an elite in Brussels, which is utterly irresponsible and does not understand the national interests of a great country like Poland. So I would say to Navratsky, go for it, and you'd have my full support. And indeed, you'd have huge support amongst, and I know amongst the Polish people, and indeed the European demos more widely.
Hear, hear. Let's hear it for realism. And hopefully, we know actually President Navratsky gave an interview to our weekly last week. So hopefully, anybody listening in the presidential palace, you know who to call in that regard. Professor, thank you so much for your time, for your brilliant insight on the current situation. And hopefully, we'll be able to talk soon as the situation develops. And you are always welcome here on DR Global. Hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you. All best to you.